Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. In January 1818, a small publishing house put out what we would now call a science fiction book about a mad scientist trying to solve the problem of death, creating a monster. The novel, of course, was Frankenstein. Its subtitle, The New Prometheus. Prometheus having been the trickster god who, in some tales, not only created humanity but stole fire from the gods in order to give it to human beings. As it turned out, the novel would be about the dark side of Prometheus. There's a remarkable passage in chapter 3. A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections, and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. And we might add, as of 2024, going into 2025, thousands of people would not have lost their jobs, both in the United States and abroad, at the hands of administrators enraptured by the power and possibility of AI. Science fiction can and often has predicted the future. Both in the past, all the way back to 1666, when The Blazing World was published as a kind of feminist manifesto, to Jules Verne, to H.G. Wells, who predicted the atomic bomb, the sexual revolution, and a number of other things, all the way through to P.J. Manny of our day, whose science fiction about human enhancement has been stolen and remade by tech bros. The mad scientists are alive and well among us. You know, it irritates many scientists, that trope of the mad scientist, because the majority of scientists do patient, steadfast, reflective, serious work. But the mad ones are there too. They're the shadow side of our Promethean technological prowess, and one might say obsession. From a Jungian perspective, a mad scientist is simply one who is seized by an archetype. And now it's living him or her. And doesn't it make a kind of archetypal and mythic sense that so many of them want to go to Mars, named after the god of war? And of course, there's been a lot of science fiction written about Mars. Edgar Rice Burroughs, Ray Bradbury, Kim Stanley Robinson. We got there before we'll get there. Same with the moon, of course. So how is it that science fiction does this? How does it predict the future? That's our focus today. I'm reminded, too, of an amusing cartoon I saw a while back where Kirk and Spock were on a street corner of the present showing a couple of kids their communicators. The kid said, is that all they do? Of course, Star Trek predicted cell phones and a lot of other stuff, too. So, to a rationalist, to somebody who only thinks in terms of the obvious and literal, science fiction authors get informed about scientific discovery and then they just project it into the future consciously. That's one way of thinking about it. Octavia Butler said, try to imagine something 30 years from now and then write about it. But there's a lot more happening than that, as she herself was well aware. Sometimes what's predicted flies in the face of what current events tell us will happen. There have been many cases of that. In such cases, what seems to be at work is that in the deep unconscious of the creative, of the writer, there is something simmering. There are the seeds of the future growing in the dark. And so the writer who engages with fantasy is tapping into those deep layers of the psychological soil. When Jung talked about collective unconscious, he didn't mean some mystical nonsense. He was talking about the fact that we all share psyche, that we all share unconsciousness together. You can see that in any family. And so certain sensitive people, including science fiction writers, are tuned in to what's happening, what's beginning in the depths, but long before it ever appears. To the writer, oftentimes, it just feels like, oh, that's a cool idea. And they write it down. And then they're surprised years or even decades later when what they wrote down happens. And oftentimes in very specific detail. So in terms of the rise of authoritarianism in the U.S., which has long been plagued by it, but which turned a corner in 2024, such that now all three branches of governments are run by authoritarians. Read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Read P.J. Manny's New Horizon Trilogy. And of course, read the one that everybody's been talking about, Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale. It's all in there. You can even go back to Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter. Those days are coming back too. So let me give a much less known example that is personal, because I've now run into this with my own fiction. It's a bit unsettling, but not entirely surprising. So during the national U.S. election of 2024, around July, it started to look like there was some hope springing forth from Kamala Harris running for office under all kinds of progressive policies, with all kinds of progressive support. There was a mood of optimism and hope. And meanwhile, for a couple of years, I had been working on my own trilogy, the Lamplighter Trilogy, which starts with the book Soulmapper, and it presents a situation where the United States has actually divided itself into the coastal states versus the heartland. So I simply took a situation that was already prevalent, the massive political polarization in this country, fed by billionaires, and I just extended it a little bit, no surprise there. But when Kamala Harris started to run, and there was all those social media images of, I got the assignment and I voted and all that, I started to wonder at one point if what I had written would be so unrealistic that maybe I would have to revise it. Because it didn't look at that point, as the summer stretched into fall, that there was going to be a divided country, that eventually the United States wouldn't be united anymore, and that some decades in the future, about 60 years in the future, there would be a government of coastal states, West Coast, East Coast, versus people in the center calling themselves true Americans. It started to feel implausible. So I thought, well, I'm going to leave it. I mean, one of the blessings of self-publishing, which is what I chose to do for these books, is that it's much easier to revise. So I thought, well, I can always edit them later. So I finished the third book. The second one's called Heartlander. The third one is Lamplighter. And in Lamplighter, part of what happens is a big campaign of reunification. It's called renewification in the States. And it happens in other countries too. It's a big worldwide celebratory protest. It's part of the climax of the book. There's other things that happen too that I won't spoil. And so I'm writing all this thinking, well, this is what's coming out of me. I mean, this is what I'm imagining and dreaming about and doing active imagination about, to use Jung's term. I guess I'll just put it down and see what happens. So then November 5th rolled around and Trump won the election, and the voices that terrorize trans people and unmarried women and all the rest of the narcissistic abuse perpetrated by the radical right was greatly amplified. And suddenly I saw all these people saying, I'm moving out of the red states. The ones who could afford it, of course. And other people on the coasts, which is where I live, saying, I'll be damned if I'll ever visit another red state again. I don't feel that way, but I have white privilege going for me. So I'm actually in touch with family members and others who are avid Trumpers. So, as these voices built and as people started to move, I thought, I really hate it when I write about stuff like this. And I didn't intend to make a prediction. I thought I was just writing fiction. But if you look at Soulmapper, which came out almost 2 years ago now, it's all in there. Not the moving around part. It's by the time Soulmapper unrolls its plot, that's already done and it's decades in the past. Things are very deeply divided. So the seeds of all that, of course, were in the national soil, so to speak, but also in other countries too. So the authoritarians now running the U.S. are deliberately and publicly planning some of what they do off the authoritarian regime of Viktor Orban in Hungary. And of course, Trump's hinted plenty of times that he's also using the Nazi playbook. And those hints are obviously deliberate. Somebody said online, I thought making America great again had something to do with fewer swastikas. And of course, when there's that level of polarization, everybody suffers. In my novel, Heartlander, there's a big argument, actually a couple of them, between Simeon Mackenzie, who's the protagonist, and his cousin, Alex, who is a Heartlander, whereas Simeon is, he spends half his time in California and half in Kansas, so he's kind of a hybrid. And they have a big argument about all of this, and of course it's advanced 60 years. But one of the points she makes is that, we're not all like that. We're not all zealots. We're not all anti-women fanatics. So Simeon has to get past some of his West Coast bias while still remaining completely clear that he cannot abide authoritarianism, which no one should. The people who support it are brainwashed. The women who support it act like abuse survivors. I've worked with plenty of them, and I saw them in my own family growing up. Some abuse survivors get brainwashed, and some go into their own healing and depart in a different direction. So it seems to me that science fiction doesn't predict the future because there is no a future, one solid future to predict. It predicts possible futures. So what's the science fiction today look like? It's an interesting mix. I'm not an expert on it, but I read as much of it as I can, and I watch films and all that. And so I've noticed that the dystopian fiction that was so popular starting around the time I was in college, and then in the decade or two after that, it remains somewhat popular because it's still relevant. I actually think the zombie apocalypse films predicted the rise of right-wing authoritarianism all over the world. But in any case, what some of the science fiction is doing now is saying we're going to come out the other side of this eventually. It's going to be hard, and a lot of people are going to suffer, and some people are going to die. And the climate is going to get worse. We know it will. But we'll come out the other side. The main thing is that we stick together. And so that's exactly what happens in my fiction. I show people staying together for the sake of creating a better future for humanity. In this country, the United States, as well as elsewhere. In my fiction, they're called the colorful riots, although they aren't violent. They're also called the colors of liberty. Creators all over the world decide enough is enough. We can't have this anymore. The artists, the filmmakers, the dancers, the playwrights, the healers, artists of every kind get together and they start standing up to the bullies. And there is pain and loss and struggle. But they're standing up for their vision of how the world could be. A just, inclusive, and even delightful world to live in together. One human family taking its place among many different species to help our home world heal itself. Biggest cause in human history. And billions of people get on board with it. In the pilot episode of Strange New Worlds, a new Star Trek series, Captain Pike visits a planet that's about to go into civil war. And the two sides can't meet, they can't agree on anything. So Pike's intervention is to show them what in Star Trek is known as World War III. It starts with competing visions of what liberty means, and it spreads from one country all over the world. And when the fighting is finally over, because hardly anybody's left to fight, a third of the population of Earth is gone. And damage is done that takes centuries to repair. And Pike points at these images and says, you're going to do this. But it's up to you. He's trying to pull them back from the brink by showing them what the consequences are, not only of that terrible destruction, but also the renewal that comes after it. And he shows these images to the whole planet. And so there's an appalled silence while everybody thinks about their future. And Pike makes clear to them, this is your opportunity. This is the point at which you can stand up. You can stand for something better. In Lamplighter Trilogy terms, you can take a step forward on the long adventure of becoming a more mature, full-spectrum, conscious species, even in the midst of this darkness. So he leaves them with the choice. Go to war or reach for the stars. Abraham Maslow wrote that every real choice in our lives is between regression and growth. So when we do regress, can we find the courage instead to start choosing growth? Thank you.